When my husband passed away, my daughter-in-law said, "If you don't help with the bills, you'll end up homeless." In desperation, I took a job as a caregiver for a wheelchair-bound billionaire. On the second night, I simply froze. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The envelope felt heavier than it should have in my trembling hands. Past due notices always did that to me, made everything feel like it weighed more than the world itself. I sat at my small kitchen table, the same one Richard and I had bought 32 years ago at a garage sale, and stared at the red letters stamped across the electric bill. "Margaret, we need to talk." I looked up to see Stephanie standing in my doorway, her perfectly manicured nails drumming against the frame. My daughter-in-law had this way of making even the simplest statement sound like a threat. She'd moved into my house after my son David died 5 years ago, claiming she needed help with the mortgage. At the time, I was so broken by grief that I would have agreed to anything if it meant keeping some connection to my boy. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, quickly shuffling the bills into a neat pile. "Would you like some coffee?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the counter and leaned against it, her arms crossed. Stephanie was beautiful in that sharp, calculated way that made people look twice. Blonde hair always perfectly styled, clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. David had been so proud when he married her, convinced he'd won some kind of prize. "I've been thinking about our living situation," she said, her voice cold and businesslike. "It's not working anymore." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Margaret, that I can't keep carrying this household financially while you contribute nothing." The words hit me like a slap. "I pay what I can. Your pension barely covers your personal expenses," she interrupted. "The mortgage, utilities, groceries, maintenance. I've been handling everything for 5 years. I'm done." I felt my cheeks burn with shame. She was right, of course. David's death had left me not just emotionally shattered, but financially vulnerable. The life insurance had barely covered the funeral costs, and my teacher's pension, while steady, was modest at best. "What are you saying?" I whispered. Stephanie pushed off from the counter and moved closer, towering over me where I sat. "I'm saying you need to start paying your fair share. Half of everything. Mortgage, utilities, groceries, insurance. That comes to about $1,800 a month." $1,800. I almost laughed at the impossibility of it. My entire pension was barely $1,100. "Stephanie, you know I don't have that kind of money. Maybe we could work out a payment plan or—" "No." Her voice was firm, final. "Either you figure out how to contribute properly, or you'll need to find somewhere else to live." The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at her, searching for any trace of the woman who had once called me mom, who had cried in my arms at David's funeral, who had promised we'd take care of each other. "You're kicking me out of my own house?" "It's not your house anymore, Margaret. David left everything to me, remember? I've been generous letting you stay this long, but my generosity has limits." My hands shook as I reached for my coffee cup, needing something to hold on to. David had changed his will after they married, putting everything in Stephanie's name for tax purposes, he'd said. I'd never questioned it because I'd never imagined I'd outlive my own son. "How long do I have?" I asked, my voice barely audible. 2 weeks to come up with the money or find alternative arrangements." She turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Margaret? Don't think about calling my parents or David's cousins. I've already spoken to them. They all agree that you need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet." After she left, I sat in my kitchen for what felt like hours, staring at the bills scattered across the table. At 58, I was too young for most senior living facilities, too old for many jobs, and too poor for almost everything else. The next morning, I found myself at the county employment office, sitting across from a cheerful young woman named Linda, who looked at my resume with barely concealed pity. "Well, Mrs. Hayworth, with your background in education, we might be able to find you some tutoring opportunities, but the pay is quite limited." "I need something that pays well," I interrupted. "Something full-time." Linda's expression grew more concerned. "At your age, and without recent work experience outside of teaching, your options are somewhat restricted." That's when she mentioned the caregiving position. "It's overnight work," she explained, "caring for a gentleman who requires assistance due to mobility issues. The pay is actually quite good, enough to meet your needs, but it's demanding work. Are you comfortable with that type of care?" I thought about Stephanie's ultimatum, about the possibility of losing the only home I'd known for decades, about becoming a burden on relatives who clearly didn't want me. Yes, I said firmly, I can do that. The agency sent me to a massive estate in the hills outside town. The house was like something from a magazine, all glass and steel and perfect landscaping. A housekeeper named Maria met me at the door and explained my duties in broken English. Mr. Richardson, he sleep very little. You stay with him at night. Help him if he need anything. He is, how you say, not happy man since accident. She led me through hallways lined with expensive art to a wing of the house that had clearly been converted for someone with disabilities. Everything was lower, wider, more accessible. He was in terrible car accident 2 years ago, Maria whispered as we walked. Lost use of his legs, some of his memory too. Very sad. He has no family, no visitors, just doctors and nurses and staff. We stopped outside a heavy wooden door. He knows you are coming tonight. I warn you, he is not always friendly. The pain, it makes him angry sometimes. The first night was exactly as difficult as Maria had warned. Mr. Richardson, Richard, he'd told me curtly when I tried to address him formally, was demanding, dismissive, and clearly resentful of needing help. He was probably in his early 60s, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that held a bitterness that seemed to go deeper than his physical injuries. But I needed this job. So I swallowed my pride, helped him when he asked, stayed quiet when he snapped at me, and tried not to take his anger personally. It was during my second night that everything changed. I was organizing his medications when he asked me to help him transfer from his wheelchair to the bed. As I positioned myself to assist him, he looked up at me with those bitter eyes, and I got my first clear look at his face in good light. The medication bottles slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor as my knees gave out beneath me. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But I would have known that face anywhere, even aged and hardened by pain and time. Richard, my husband who had died 30 years ago in a car accident in Germany. The man I had never stopped loving was sitting right in front of me, and he had no idea who I was. Are you having some kind of medical emergency? Richard's voice cut through the ringing in my ears. Should I call for help? I was on my knees on his bedroom floor, surrounded by scattered pill bottles, staring up at the face that had haunted my dreams for 30 years. The face I'd kissed goodbye the morning he left for that business trip to Germany. The face I'd identified in a morgue photograph that was so badly damaged I'd had to rely on dental records. I'm fine, I managed to whisper, scrambling to collect the medications. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the bottles. Richard watched me with a mixture of irritation and concern. You don't look fine. You look like you've seen a ghost. If only he knew. I forced myself to breathe, to think rationally. This was impossible. Richard Hayworth had died in a car accident in Munich 30 years ago. I'd received the call from the embassy. I'd flown to Germany to identify the body. I'd buried him in Evergreen Cemetery, Plot 247, Section C. I'd visited his grave every month for decades. But the man sitting in the wheelchair in front of me had Richard's cleft chin, his distinctive nose that had been broken in high school football, the same scar through his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen off his bike as a child. Details that couldn't be coincidental. I should go get Maria, I said, standing on unsteady legs. No, his voice was sharp. Don't wake her over your clumsiness. Just help me get to bed and we'll pretend this didn't happen. As I assisted him with the transfer, I tried to study his face without being obvious. There were differences, of course. He was older, as we all were. The accident had left him with some facial scarring, and there was a hardness in his expression that the Richard I'd known had never possessed. But the fundamental bone structure, the way his ears sat against his head, the pattern of freckles on his forearms, it was all achingly familiar. How long have you been paralyzed? I asked, as I helped him settle into bed. He gave me a sharp look. Is that any of your business? I'm sorry, the agency didn't give me many details about your condition. Richard sighed, suddenly looking exhausted. 2 years. Car accident on the Pacific Coast Highway. Crushed 2 vertebrae, damaged my spinal cord. The doctors say I'm lucky to be alive. My mind raced. 2 years ago would have been 2022. Richard had supposedly died in 1992. Where had he been for the 30 years in between? Do you remember the accident clearly? I pressed gently. Not much. I was unconscious for 3 weeks. When I woke up, I had some memory issues. He studied my face. Why are you asking so many questions? Are you some kind of reporter? No, of course not. I'm just making conversation. Well, don't. I don't pay you to chat. I pay you to do your job quietly. I nodded and busied myself organizing his nightstand, but my mind was spinning. Memory issues. That could explain why he didn't recognize me, but it didn't explain how he was alive when I'd buried him 3 decades ago. Over the next few hours, as Richard slept fitfully, I found myself studying every detail of the room, looking for clues. There were no personal photographs, no mementos that might give insight into his life. The art on the walls was expensive but impersonal. The books on his shelves were mostly business and finance texts. When dawn broke, Maria arrived to take over the day shift. I was gathering my things when she pulled me aside. How was your first night with Mr. Richardson? It was educational, I said carefully. Maria, can I ask you something? How long have you worked for him? Almost 2 years, since just after his accident. Why? Do you know anything about his life before the accident? Family? Friends? Maria shook her head. He never talks about before. The lawyers who hired me, they said he has no family. Very sad to be so alone. Lawyers? See, from big firm downtown. They handle all his business while he recovers. Mr. Richardson, he was very successful businessman before accident, they tell me. Made fortune in technology investments. I left the estate that morning with more questions than answers. Instead of going home to face Stephanie's cold stare, I drove to the public library and spent hours on the computer, searching for any information about Richard Richardson. What I found was bizarre. There were business articles dating back about 15 years, describing him as a self-made millionaire who'd built a tech consulting empire from nothing. But before that, nothing. It was as if Richard Richardson had simply materialized into existence in his mid-40s with a fully formed business and no personal history. I searched for Richard Hayworth next, my husband's name. The obituary was there, exactly as I remembered it. Survived by his loving wife Margaret and son David. Services held at St. Mary's Catholic Church. Burial at Evergreen Cemetery. But if the man in that wheelchair wasn't Richard Hayworth, why did he look exactly like him? And if he was Richard Hayworth, how had he become Richard Richardson? I drove to Evergreen Cemetery, something I hadn't done in months. The headstone was still there, weathered but readable. Richard James Hayworth, 1962-1992. Beloved husband and father. I knelt beside the grave, running my fingers over the carved letters. Richard, I whispered, if you're really in there, I'm losing my mind, but if you're not. That evening, I returned to the estate with a plan. I needed to know the truth, but I had to be careful. If this really was Richard, something had happened that he either couldn't remember or couldn't talk about. Pushing too hard might make him shut down completely. I also needed this job. Stephanie's deadline was looming, and even if this man wasn't my husband, he was still my only hope of earning enough money to keep my home. You're back, Richard said when I entered his room. He was sitting by the window, staring out at the gardens. Did you think I wouldn't be? People don't usually last long working for me. I'm told I'm not particularly pleasant company. I studied his profile as he gazed out the window. What do you remember about your life before the accident? He was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, fragments. Business meetings, numbers, deals. Nothing personal. The doctors said traumatic brain injuries can affect autobiographical memory while leaving other functions intact. That must be terrifying, not remembering who you were. Sometimes I get flashes, a woman's laugh, the smell of coffee brewing, music that sounds familiar but I can't place, but nothing concrete, nothing that helps me understand who I was before I became this. He gestured to his wheelchair. My heart ached for him, whether he was my Richard or not. Maybe the memories will come back gradually. Maybe. Or maybe Richard Richardson before the accident is gone forever and this is all that's left. I moved closer to the window, standing beside his chair. Do you ever feel like you've lost something important? Something you can't name but you know it's missing? He looked up at me then, really looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition? Confusion? Pain? Every day, he said quietly. Every single day I feel like there's a piece of me missing. Something that would make all of this make sense. I reached out without thinking and touched his shoulder gently. I'm sorry. That sounds like a very lonely way to live. He didn't pull away from my touch. Instead, he covered my hand with his own, and I felt the same electric connection I'd felt the first time Richard Hayworth had held my hand 40 years ago. It is lonely, he admitted. Which is probably why I'm telling a complete stranger things I've never told my doctors. But I wasn't a complete stranger. I was the woman who had loved him, married him, lost him, and mourned him for 30 years. And now, impossibly, I was the woman who might get the chance to love him again. If only I could figure out how to help him remember what we'd once meant to each other. Over the next 2 weeks, I developed a routine that felt both natural and heartbreaking. Each night, I would arrive at the estate as the sun was setting, and Richard would be waiting in his study, usually reading or staring out at the gardens. He'd grown less hostile toward me, though he still maintained a careful distance. I started bringing small things with me. Nothing obvious, just items that might trigger memories without seeming deliberate. A thermos of coffee that I'd brew exactly the way Richard used to like it, strong with just a hint of cream. Classical music playing softly on my phone, the same pieces he used to hum while working in his garage. A crossword puzzle book, because my Richard had been addicted to them. You don't have to entertain me, he said one evening as I set up the music. I'm perfectly capable of sitting in silence. I know you are, but I like music while I work, if that's okay with you. The piece playing was Pachelbel's Canon, the song we'd danced to at our wedding. I watched Richard's face carefully as the familiar melody filled the room. His expression grew distant, almost troubled. I know this song, he said slowly. My heart jumped. It's a beautiful piece, very popular for weddings. Weddings. He repeated the word like he was testing how it felt in his mouth. I have this strange feeling when I hear it. Not quite a memory, but something close. I forced my voice to remain casual. What kind of feeling? Happiness and loss, like remembering a perfect day that ended badly. He looked at me with those familiar green eyes. Does that make any sense? Perfect sense, I whispered. As the nights passed, I began sharing carefully edited stories from my own life. Stories that had once been our life together, but that I presented as my own experiences. I told him about the house I'd lived in with my first husband, describing our little kitchen with the yellow walls and the herb garden by the back door. He sounds like he was a good man, your first husband, Richard said one night. He was. We were very young when we married, barely 22, but we were happy. I paused, watching his reaction. He used to say that the secret to a good marriage was making your spouse laugh at least once every day. Richard smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. That's not bad advice. What happened to him? The truth caught in my throat. He died in a car accident, in Germany while traveling for business. Richard went very still. Germany. Yes, Munich. I was supposed to go with him, but I was pregnant and the doctor said it wasn't safe to travel. I watched his face carefully. I've always wondered what would have happened if I'd insisted on going anyway. The accident might have killed you both, he said quietly. Maybe. Or maybe having me there would have changed something. Maybe we would have left the hotel 5 minutes earlier or later. Maybe the accident never would have happened at all. Richard was staring at his hands, his brow furrowed in concentration. Munich, he repeated. There's something about that city. When you said the name, I felt... What did you feel? Terror. Absolute terror. Like something terrible happened there. He looked up at me. Do you think it's possible to have memories of things that happened to other people? Or memories of places you've never been? I chose my words carefully. I think trauma can leave marks on us in ways we don't fully understand. Maybe you saw something on the news or heard a story that affected you deeply. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Richard was remembering his own death. Or what should have been his death. Somehow, some way, My husband had survived that crash and lost 30 years of his life in the process. The breakthrough came during my 3rd week on the job. I was helping Richard with his evening medications when I hummed without thinking. A lullaby I used to sing to David when he was small, the same one Richard used to hum when he was working on projects around the house. Richard's head snapped up. "What was that song?" "I'm sorry, was I humming? I didn't realize." "Sing it again, please." I hesitated, then sang the first few lines of the lullaby. Richard's eyes grew wide, and his hands began to shake. "I know that song," he said urgently. "Not just know it, I can hear someone singing it. A woman's voice. He pressed his palms against his temples. "She's singing to a little boy, a baby." My throat tightened. "What else do you remember?" Hands, small hands touching my face, a laugh, a kitchen with yellow walls. He looked at me desperately. "These aren't my memories, are they? They can't be. I don't have a child." I wanted to tell him everything in that moment. I wanted to show him the pictures in my wallet of David as a baby, as a toddler, as a young man. I wanted to explain that those small hands had been mine, that the laugh he remembered was mine, that the yellow kitchen was ours. Instead, I said gently, "Memory is a strange thing after trauma. Maybe these are fragments of someone else's story that somehow got mixed up with yours." But Richard wasn't buying it. "No, these feel too real, too personal. There's emotion attached to them. Love. Deep, overwhelming love." He grabbed my arm. "Margaret, I think I might have had a family before the accident. A wife. A child. What if they're out there somewhere, not knowing I'm alive?" The irony of his words was like a knife to my heart. His family was right here. Had been right here all along, taking care of him without him knowing. "Have you talked to your lawyers about this? Maybe they could help you investigate." Richard shook his head. "I've tried. They say there are no records of any family, no marriage certificate, no birth certificates for children. They insist Richard Richardson has always been a bachelor, but you think Richard Richardson isn't your real name. I'm starting to wonder. These memories, they don't fit with the life everyone says I lived. The business success, the solitary lifestyle, the focus on money over relationships. The man in these fragments isn't like that at all." I stayed with him later than usual that night, sitting beside his bed as he struggled to piece together the puzzle of his identity. Several times he would start to say something, then stop himself, as if the words were right there but just out of reach. "There's something else," he finally said. "In the clearest memory, the woman singing the lullaby. I can see her face, not clearly, but enough to know she was beautiful. Brown hair, kind eyes, and I loved her. God, how I loved her." I had to look away before he could see the tears in my eyes. "She sounds wonderful," I managed. "I keep thinking I'll see her again someday, that she'll walk through a door and everything will make sense again." He laughed bitterly. "Foolish, isn't it? Fantasizing about a woman who might not even exist. It's not foolish. Hope never is." The next morning, as I was preparing to leave, Richard called out to me. "Margaret, wait." I turned back to find him wheeling his chair toward me, something determined in his expression. "I want to try something. It might sound crazy, but I need to know." "What kind of something?" "I want you to touch my face, the way the woman in my memory did." My breath caught. "Richard, I don't think that's appropriate. I'm your caregiver, and please, I know it's strange, but something about you. From the first night you were here, I've felt like I should know you, like you're important somehow." With trembling hands, I reached up and gently cupped his face, my thumbs tracing the familiar contours of his cheekbones. His eyes fluttered closed, and I saw his breathing change. "My God," he whispered, "it's you. You're the woman in the memories." For a moment, hope flared in my chest. But then his eyes opened, and I saw confusion there instead of recognition. "But that's impossible," he continued. You're my caregiver. We just met 3 weeks ago. Unless what? Unless you're not who you say you are either. The walls I'd built around the truth were starting to crumble, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for what would happen when they finally fell completely. I barely slept that day. Richard's words echoed in my mind. Unless you're not who you say you are either. He was so close to the truth, and I was terrified of what would happen when he found it. When I arrived at the estate that evening, I found Richard in his study, but he wasn't alone. A man in an expensive suit was sitting across from him, a briefcase open on the desk between them. Margaret, Richard said when he saw me. This is Mr. Patterson, my attorney. I've asked him to do some research. Patterson stood and shook my hand with the kind of grip that was meant to intimidate. Ms. Hayworth, Mr. Richardson has some questions about his past that we're hoping you might be able to help with. My stomach dropped. I'm not sure how I could help. I only met Mr. Richardson a few weeks ago. That's what makes this so interesting, Patterson said, settling back into his chair. You see, we've been investigating Mr. Richardson's memories, the ones that have been surfacing recently, and we've made some fascinating discoveries. Richard was watching me intently. Margaret, what's your full name? Margaret Hayworth. And your first husband's name? My mouth felt dry. Richard Hayworth. Patterson pulled a file from his briefcase. Here's where things get complicated, Ms. Hayworth. We've found records of a Richard Hayworth who died in Munich in 1992, survived by his wife Margaret and son David. But we've also found something else. He handed me a photograph, and my world tilted. It was a driver's license photo, clearly taken in the mid-1990s. The name read Richard Richardson, but the face was unmistakably my husband's, just a few years older than when I'd last seen him alive. Where did you get this? I whispered. From the California DMV, Patterson said. It seems that in 1993, 1 year after Richard Hayworth supposedly died, a man named Richard Richardson applied for a driver's license using a birth certificate that we now know was fraudulent. Richard was staring at the photograph with a mixture of recognition and horror. That's me, but I don't remember taking this picture. I don't remember anything from the 90s. I sank into the nearest chair, the photograph trembling in my hands. This is impossible. Actually, Patterson continued, it's quite possible if you know how these things work. Identity theft, witness protection, deliberate disappearance. There are many reasons someone might assume a new identity. But why? Richard demanded. Why would I fake my own death? Why would I abandon my family? Patterson looked at me meaningfully. That's what we were hoping Ms. Hayworth could tell us, since it appears her husband didn't actually die in that car accident. The room was spinning. All these weeks of carefully managing the truth, and now it was exploding around me like shrapnel. I need to explain, I said quietly. Richard wheeled his chair closer to me. Start from the beginning, and this time, tell me everything. I took a shaky breath. 30 years ago, you left for a business trip to Munich. 3 days later, I got a call from the State Department saying you'd been killed in a car accident. The body was badly damaged. I identified you through dental records and personal effects, but it wasn't me. Apparently not. I buried someone else, mourned someone else, raised our son alone believing his father was dead. Richard's face had gone very pale. Our son, David, the little boy in my memories. I nodded, tears starting to fall. He died 5 years ago, cancer. He never knew his father was alive. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at me with an expression I couldn't read. Shock, anger, grief, all mixed together. You knew, he said finally. That first night, when you saw me, you knew who I was. Yes, and you said nothing. What was I supposed to say? Richard, you were dead. I buried you. I grieved you. I moved on with my life because I had no choice. And then suddenly you're here, calling yourself by a different name, with no memory of me or David or the life we shared. Patterson cleared his throat. If I may interrupt, there's more. We've traced Mr. Richardson's financial history. The business empire, the investments. It all started with a significant cash deposit in 1994. Almost like someone was starting over with a substantial nest egg. Richard rubbed his temples. I don't understand any of this. If I'm really Richard Hayworth, Why don't I remember? And why would I have left my family? Maybe you didn't leave voluntarily, I said, the thought occurring to me for the first time. Maybe something happened in Munich. Maybe someone forced you to disappear. Or maybe, Richard said bitterly, I was just a coward who wanted out of his responsibilities. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. The Richard I married would never have abandoned his family. Never. Which means something else happened. Something that made you disappear and lose your memories. Patterson was taking notes. We'll need to investigate further. Look into what actually happened in Munich, who the real victim was, how Mr. Richardson obtained his new identity. I don't want investigations, Richard said suddenly. I want to remember. I want to understand how I could have forgotten the most important things in my life. He looked at me directly, and I saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not recognition exactly, but acceptance. Tell me about our life together, he said. All of it. Maybe if I hear our story, it will help bring back what I've lost. So I told him. I told him about meeting in college, about our first kiss under the oak tree by the library. I told him about our tiny wedding with just 12 guests, about the apartment with the leaky faucet that he could never quite fix. I told him about the night David was born, how Richard had cried when he first held his son. I told him about the mornings when he would make coffee and hum that lullaby, about how he always left little notes in my lunch bag when I was student teaching. I told him about his dreams of starting his own consulting firm, about the trip to Germany that was supposed to be his big break. You were everything to me, I finished. You and David. When I lost you both, I thought my life was over. Richard had been silent throughout my recitation, his eyes closed, as if he was trying to will the memories back into existence. I can feel it, he said finally. Not clear memories, but emotions. Love. Such overwhelming love for you and for David. And guilt. Terrible guilt about something. What kind of guilt? I don't know, but it's connected to why I left. I'm certain of that now. Patterson stood up, closing his briefcase. I'll continue the investigation on my end. In the meantime, perhaps spending time together will help recover more memories. After he left, Richard and I sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he spoke. I'm sorry. For what? For leaving you. For abandoning David. For not being there when you needed me. His voice broke. Even if I can't remember why I did it, I know that losing me must have destroyed you. I moved to kneel beside his wheelchair, taking his hands in mine. You're here now. That's what matters. But am I? Am I really the man you married, or am I just a stranger wearing his face? I looked into his eyes, seeing past the years and the pain and the confusion to something deeper, something that had never changed. You're Richard, I said with absolute certainty. You're my Richard, and I'm going to help you remember everything we had together. He squeezed my hands, and for the first time since I'd found him again, I saw hope in his expression. Where do we start? I smiled through my tears. We start by going home. The next evening, I arrived at Richard's estate with a box of photo albums and mementos I'd kept stored in my closet for decades. My heart was lighter than it had been in years. Richard was my husband. He was alive, and slowly but surely, he was coming back to me. What I didn't expect was to find Stephanie sitting in Richard's study, her perfectly manicured hands folded in her lap, wearing the kind of smile that had always made my skin crawl. Hello, Margaret, she said sweetly. Richard and I have been having the most interesting conversation. Richard's expression was guarded, confused. He looked between Stephanie and me like he was trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Margaret, he said slowly, your daughter-in-law has told me some disturbing things about your marriage to me. To Richard Hayworth. My stomach dropped. What kind of things? Stephanie stood up gracefully, smoothing her skirt. I simply shared some family history that I thought Richard should know. About how unhappy you were in your first marriage. About how you used to complain that Richard Hayworth was holding you back from your dreams. That's not true, isn't it? Stephanie tilted her head, feigning concern. Margaret, you told me yourself that you only married Richard because you were pregnant, that if David hadn't come along, you would have left him years earlier. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had said something like that, but not in the way she was implying. It had been during one of our rare heart-to-heart conversations after David's funeral, when I was drowning in grief and guilt. I'd wondered aloud if Richard and I would have stayed together without David to bind us, if we would have grown apart naturally, rather than being torn apart by tragedy. It had been the rambling thoughts of a grieving mother, not a declaration of how I'd actually felt. "You're twisting my words," I said. "Am I? Because I also remember you mentioning how relieved you were when Richard died, how it freed you from a marriage that had become suffocating." Richard's face had gone very pale. "Is this true, Margaret?" "No." "Stephanie, why are you doing this?" But I knew why. Somehow, she'd figured out who Richard really was, and she was terrified of losing control over me. As long as I was a poor widow dependent on her charity, she had power. But if I reconciled with my wealthy, very much alive husband, that dynamic would shift completely. Stephanie moved closer to Richard, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "I'm doing this because I care about both of you. Margaret has been through so much trauma, losing her first husband and then David. I'm worried that seeing you is bringing back some unhealthy feelings that she's projecting onto you." "What do you mean?" Richard asked. "I mean," Stephanie said gently, "that Margaret so desperately wants her dead husband back that she's convinced herself you're him. But Richard, you can't be expected to live up to the fantasy of a dead man." I watched in horror as doubt crept into Richard's expression. "Margaret, is that what this is? Are you trying to turn me into someone I'm not?" "Richard, no. You are the man I married. You are David's father. Everything I told you yesterday was true." Stephanie shook her head sadly. "Margaret, honey, I know you want to believe that, but think about it logically. If this man really was your husband, don't you think he would remember you? Don't you think 30 years of marriage would have left some impression?" "He has remembered things. The lullaby, the kitchen, our faces." "Suggestion," Stephanie interrupted. "You've been feeding him details about your life with Richard Hayworth, and his damaged brain is creating false memories to fill in the gaps." Richard was rubbing his temples, looking increasingly distressed. "I don't know what to believe anymore." "You should believe the evidence," Stephanie said. "And the evidence says that you're Richard Richardson, a successful businessman with no family. This fantasy that Margaret has created isn't healthy for either of you." I felt panic rising in my chest. "Richard, look at me. Really look at me. You said yourself that you felt like you should know me. You said touching my face brought back memories." "I thought it did," he said uncertainly. "But maybe Stephanie's right. Maybe I just wanted so badly to have some connection to someone that I convinced myself there was something there." Stephanie smiled triumphantly. "I think it would be best if Margaret took some time away from this situation. Let you heal without the confusion of false memories." "No." I moved closer to Richard's wheelchair. "Richard, I can prove who you are. I have our marriage certificate, photos of our wedding, documentation. Documentation can be forged," Stephanie said smoothly. "Photos can be doctored. Margaret, you're a smart woman, but grief can make people do desperate things." I stared at her, finally understanding the full scope of her manipulation. She hadn't just stumbled upon the truth about Richard's identity. She'd been planning this confrontation, preparing her arguments to undermine everything I'd built with him. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Known what?" "How long have you known that Richard Richardson was my husband?" Stephanie's mask of concern slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating woman beneath. "I don't know what you're talking about. The timing is too convenient. You show up here just as Richard and I are reconnecting, armed with exactly the right accusations to make him doubt everything. You've been watching me, haven't you? Following me." Richard looked between us, confusion evident on his face. "Someone needs to explain what's really going on here." I took a deep breath. "Stephanie is afraid of losing control over me. As long as I'm a poor widow who needs her charity, she has power. But if I reconcile with my husband, with you, everything changes." "That's ridiculous," Stephanie said, but her voice had lost some of its sweetness. "I'm trying to protect you both from a harmful delusion." "Are you? Or are you trying to protect yourself from losing the house that I've been paying for, the lifestyle that my pension has been supporting?" Richard's eyes sharpened. "Margaret, what is she talking about?" Before I could answer, Stephanie jumped in. "Margaret has been having financial difficulties since David died. I've been helping her, giving her a place to live, but she's become dependent, resentful. This fantasy about you being her dead husband is her way of escaping her current reality. That's not true, I said firmly. Stephanie, tell him about the ultimatum you gave me. Tell him about the $1,800 a month you demanded I pay or face eviction from my own home. Stephanie's composure cracked further. That's not how it happened. Isn't it? Tell him how you threatened to throw me out if I couldn't contribute more financially. Tell him how that threat is what forced me to take this job in the first place. Richard was looking at Stephanie with new eyes now. Is this true? Margaret is. She's confused. Grief affects people differently. Stop lying. The words came out sharper than I intended. Richard, this woman has been extorting me for years. She inherited everything when David died, and she's used that power to control and humiliate me. The only reason she's here now is because she's realized that if you and I reconnect, her meal ticket disappears. Stephanie's face had gone red. You ungrateful, she caught herself, but not before Richard heard the venom in her voice. I think, Richard said quietly, that you should leave, Stephanie. Richard, you're making a mistake. This woman is manipulating you. Get out. His voice was cold, authoritative. Now. After Stephanie left, slamming the door behind her, Richard and I sat in heavy silence. I could see him processing everything he'd heard, trying to separate truth from manipulation. She was right about one thing, he said finally. My heart sank. What? I don't remember our marriage. I don't remember being David's father. I have fragments, impressions, but nothing concrete. He looked at me with eyes full of pain. How can I be sure that what I'm feeling for you is real and not just wishful thinking? I stood up and walked to the box I'd brought, pulling out our wedding album. With trembling hands, I opened it to the first page. A photo of Richard and me cutting our wedding cake, both of us laughing at something someone had said. Look at this picture, I said, sitting beside him. Really look at it. Richard studied the photograph for a long time. I watched his expression change. Saw something shift in his eyes. We look happy, he said softly. We were so young and so sure that love could conquer anything. I turned the page. This is from our honeymoon. Remember how it rained the entire week? No, he paused, staring at a photo of us standing under an umbrella, both soaked but grinning. Wait, there was something about rain, about being stuck inside a cabin, playing cards, and making grilled cheese sandwiches on the fireplace grate because the power went out. I finished. Richard's eyes widened. Oh my God. I remember that. I remember burning the first batch and you laughing so hard you couldn't breathe. I felt tears of relief streaming down my face. You're coming back to me. He reached over and took my hand, his grip strong and sure. I'm trying. God help me. I'm trying. But even as we looked through the photos together, even as more memories began to surface, I couldn't shake the feeling that Stephanie wasn't finished with us. She had too much to lose to give up easily, and I was right to be worried, because the next morning, I would discover just how far she was willing to go to destroy what Richard and I were rebuilding. I woke up to my phone ringing at 6 a.m. Through my grogginess, I saw Richard's name on the screen and answered immediately, fearing something had happened. Margaret, you need to get here now. His voice was tense, urgent. Stephanie came back. She brought lawyers. I threw on clothes and drove to the estate faster than I'd ever driven in my life. When I arrived, I found 3 black cars in the driveway and voices coming from Richard's study, angry, argumentative voices. Maria met me at the door, her face pale with worry. Miss Margaret, they say Mr. Richardson is not who he says he is. They have papers, official things. They want to take him away. My blood turned to ice. I rushed to the study where I found Richard surrounded by men in expensive suits. Stephanie stood behind them, wearing an expression of smug satisfaction. Ah, Mrs. Hayworth, one of the lawyers said when he saw me. Perfect timing. We were just explaining to Mr. Richardson here that there are serious questions about his identity and mental competency. What are you talking about? I demanded. Stephanie stepped forward, holding a thick file. I did some research after our conversation yesterday, Margaret, and I discovered some very interesting things about Richard Richardson's medical history. She opened the file with theatrical precision. It seems that Mr. Richardson has been declared mentally incompetent by the state of California. following his accident 2 years ago. His financial affairs are supposed to be managed by a court-appointed guardian. Richard's face had gone white. That's not true. I manage my own affairs. Actually, another lawyer interjected, you don't. These gentlemen here have been illegally managing your estate. We represent the court-appointed guardian, and we're here to take you into proper care. I felt the room spinning around me. This is insane. Richard is perfectly competent. Is he? Stephanie asked sweetly. Because yesterday he seemed quite confused about his own identity. Isn't that right, Richard? You told me yourself that you weren't sure who you really were. Richard looked trapped, cornered. I was working through some memory issues, but that doesn't mean memory issues severe enough that you believe you're a dead man, one of the lawyers said. Mr. Richardson, we have documentation showing that you've been living under a delusion, believing yourself to be someone who died 30 years ago. Because I am that person, Richard said desperately. Margaret, show them the photos, the marriage certificate. Fabrications, Stephanie said dismissively. Margaret has been feeding you false memories to support her fantasy. Haven't you, Margaret? I stared at her, finally understanding the full scope of her plan. She hadn't just wanted to discredit me with Richard. She'd wanted to have him declared incompetent so she could control his fortune through whatever guardian she'd bribed or manipulated. This is fraud, I said. All of it. What's fraud? Stephanie replied. Is a delusional woman convincing a mentally ill man that he's her dead husband. But as the lawyers continued their assault, I noticed something. Richard wasn't cowering anymore. His expression had changed, hardened into something I recognized, the determination he'd always shown when someone tried to push him around. Gentlemen, he said, his voice suddenly strong and clear. I'd like to see this court order you're talking about. The head lawyer hesitated. Mr. Richardson, in your condition, my condition is fine. My memory may have some gaps, but my intelligence is intact. Show me the paperwork. As they fumbled with their briefcases, Richard turned to me. Margaret, call Patterson. Tell him to get here immediately. Richard, they might not let me. They'll let you. Because I'm not going anywhere with these people until my attorney reviews whatever they're claiming gives them authority over me. What happened next was like watching dominoes fall. Patterson arrived within an hour, took one look at the supposed court documents, and began making phone calls. Within another hour, we learned that the court-appointed guardian was a man who'd been disbarred 3 years ago for embezzlement. The lawyers weren't lawyers at all, but actors Stephanie had hired. The entire elaborate scheme was designed to kidnap Richard and force him to sign documents transferring his wealth to accounts she controlled. You orchestrated all of this, I said to Stephanie as the real police led the fake lawyers away in handcuffs. She maintained her innocence even as they read her rights. I was trying to protect him from your manipulation, Margaret. Everything I did was for his own good, but Richard and I both knew better. When the dust settled and the last police car had left the estate, we found ourselves alone in his study, surrounded by the scattered remains of what should have been our reunion. I'm sorry, Richard said quietly. I should have seen through her manipulations from the beginning. How could you have? You're dealing with memory loss, and she's had years to perfect her lies. He wheeled his chair closer to where I sat on the couch. Margaret, I need to tell you something. During all that chaos, while they were threatening to take me away, something happened. What? I remembered. Not everything, but enough. His eyes were bright with emotion. I remembered our wedding day. I remembered holding David for the first time. I remembered the morning I left for Germany and how you begged me not to go because you had a bad feeling about the trip. My heart stopped. You remember leaving? I remember getting to Munich, checking into the hotel. I remember going to a business meeting that turned out to be something else entirely. His expression darkened. There were men there, Margaret. Men who said I'd seen something I shouldn't have seen. Knew something that could hurt powerful people. What kind of something? Corporate espionage, money laundering. I stumbled into a meeting I was never supposed to witness. He ran his hands through his hair. They gave me a choice. Disappear completely, assume a new identity, and never contact my family again, or they would kill you and David. The room felt like it was tilting. So you chose to disappear. I chose to protect you. They staged my death, gave me enough money to start over somewhere else, and made it clear that if I ever tried to contact you or David, they would follow through on their threats. Tears were streaming down my face. All these years, I thought you had abandoned us. Never. Not for 1 second. But they were watching, Margaret. For years, they were watching to make sure I stayed dead. It wasn't until the accident 2 years ago, when I lost so much of my memory, that their surveillance finally stopped. They figured a man who couldn't remember his own name wasn't a threat anymore. And when your memories started coming back, I think some part of me was afraid they'd find out. That's why I was so resistant at first, so angry. My subconscious was trying to protect you even when my conscious mind didn't understand why. I moved to kneel beside his wheelchair, taking his hands in mine. "Richard, what does this mean for us now?" "It means," he said, cupping my face with gentle hands, "that I'm done hiding. I'm done letting fear keep me away from the woman I love. We've lost 30 years, Margaret. I won't lose another day." He leaned forward and kissed me, and it was like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. When we broke apart, I saw something in his eyes that had been missing for so long. Hope. "Will you marry me again?" he asked softly. "I know it sounds crazy, but I want to do it right this time. I want to stand up in front of everyone and promise to love you for whatever time we have left." I laughed through my tears. "Yes. Yes, of course I'll marry you again." 6 months later, we stood in the same church where we'd been married 40 years ago. The guest list was small, a few old friends who were overjoyed to see Richard alive, some neighbors who'd known us in the early days, Patterson and his wife. But the most important guest wasn't there. David's absence was a wound that would never fully heal, but we'd found a way to honor his memory. Richard had established a foundation in David's name, providing college scholarships for children who'd lost parents. It wasn't bringing our son back, but it was a way to make sure his life had meaning beyond our grief. As for Stephanie, she was serving 5 years for fraud and attempted kidnapping. The house that had been David's, our house, was back in my name, where it belonged. Richard had insisted on that before anything else. "Do you, Richard, take Margaret to be your wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Richard said, his voice strong and sure, again and always. When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, Richard struggled to his feet from his wheelchair. It was something he'd been working toward in physical therapy, a surprise he'd been planning for months. He stood there, shaky but determined, and kissed me the way he had on our wedding day 40 years ago. "I love you, Mrs. Richardson Hayworth," he whispered against my lips. "I love you too," I whispered back. "Welcome home." That night, as we sat on the terrace of our new home, a single-story house that accommodated Richard's wheelchair but felt like ours in a way the estate never had, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us back together. "Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if none of this had happened?" I asked. "If you'd never gone to Germany? If we'd just grown old together the normal way?" Richard took my hand, running his thumb over the wedding ring I'd never taken off. "Sometimes. But then I think about how much we appreciate each other now, how grateful we are for every day we have together. Maybe we needed to lose each other to really understand what we had. 30 years is a long time to learn that lesson, but we learned it, and we have however many years are left to us to get it right." I leaned against his shoulder, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere in the distance, a woman was humming a lullaby to her child, and Richard smiled. "I remember that song," he said softly. "Good," I said. "Hold on to that memory. Hold on to all of them." And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I knew that whatever time we had left together, we wouldn't waste another moment of it. We were home at last. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.